For today's session, we're joined by Emily Cook, a software engineer. Emily has worked in tech since 2016, working with tech firms in London and Hamburg. After making the career switch to coding in 2020, Emily is a major advocate for making tech accessible, leading workshops, mentoring candidates, and hosting events aimed at helping others break into tech. Emily has also been contributed and been part of the following communities: Google Women TechMakers in Hamburg, PyData Global 2021, and Bristol's TechSpark and PHP Southwest. If you've been wondering what accessibility is, why it is important, then this talk is just what you need. With a focus on front-end development, Emily will also cover 5 things you need to know in order to boost accessibility. Welcome to DevLab, Emily. How are you?
Very well, thanks, Maria. How's it going?
Oh, good. Very excited for your talk.
Thank you. Just a quick question. Can you see my slides currently?
Yes.
Fantastic. Amazing. Thanks. Yeah, well, thanks. Fantastic introduction there. There's not really much more you need to know about me, but just to run over again, my name is Emily. I'm a software engineer and I'm based in Bristol. Today, I'm presenting on something that is really, really important to me, web accessibility specifically. And yeah, today I just want to touch on 5 things that you might not know about web accessibility. So just the kind of first question, like why, why this topic? Originally, I was an arts graduate. I came from a languages background. I went into marketing, learned to code, and made the career switch. And I sometimes ask myself, why did I do this? It's kind of a big jump. And the thing I love about tech is, and generally the concept of the digital space, is that it is more or less very levelizing and equalizing. Of course, there are other concepts you can talk about, but essentially the internet and web services have made a vast amount of information very, very easily accessible, which has vastly improved the quality of life of millions of humans around the world. And that's all well and good as long as you have access to it. So essentially the World Wide Web was built to serve and be accessed by everyone, but unfortunately not everyone can access it and be part of it due to physical or situational disabilities or even socioeconomic factors. And since I've been working in tech companies, either as a developer or not, it's come to my attention that it's maybe something we could maybe inform ourselves a little bit more about and dive a little bit more deeper into. So first of all, what is web accessibility? So essentially, web accessibility is ensuring that websites, digital tools, technologies can be used by absolutely anyone. So in terms of how a user comprehends, navigates, or interacts, or even contributes to the web, they can do so regardless of any limitation that they might have. Factors. Well, essentially, in a nutshell, web accessibility is trying to ensure that anyone can access the web. Physical, situational, or socioeconomic limitations need not limit your accessibility. So essentially, this practice is putting to the fore users who, for whatever reason, might not be able to participate in the internet and therefore will have an impacted experience of a product or a service, or even have a huge impact on their quality of life. According to some WebAIM analysis, a shocking 90% of the top 1 million homepages don't comply with basic web accessibility guidelines. So you can imagine that typically web accessibility in general is not really a theme in a lot of companies, and this impacts a lot more people than we would consider. For example, I can imagine a lot of us, and probably myself included, would have initially thought web accessibility was ensuring that products and services were available for people with disabilities. However, this also covers people with situational disabilities. For example, if you have a broken arm or have an eye operation, for example, or even socioeconomic factors such as poor internet coverage in your area, slow or outdated devices that can't properly access the internet. All of these are factors, but one of the questions I asked myself was, how many of us have perfect vision, hearing, dexterity, and cognition? Some of us on this call might be thinking, well, might be lucky enough to be saying yes to all of this, but the real leveler for me is that essentially most of us are living in an aging population, and oftentimes, I say oftentimes, the elephant in the room is that we're all getting older, and essentially we'll all have limitations to our own accessibility, whether we like it or not, because typically with age, cognitive and motor skills decline. Therefore, using digital products can become more difficult if web accessibility isn't considered. So it just goes to show that web accessibility actually affects all of us. And I think as tech professionals as well, it makes sense to be having this at front of mind, because essentially, yes, we want to make our products accessible for everyone, but we also want our products to be accessible for us later in life. Why would we code or create products which we can't use or will find difficult to use in the coming years? So my first use case, so I've got 5 use cases for us, and kind of 5 did you knows, probably more than 5 to be honest, 5 did you knows about web accessibility. The first one is about the elderly experience of using the internet. So, according to the UN, there are 727 million persons over the age of 65 in the world, and the majority of these senior users spend at least 6 hours a day online and have about 5 different devices. So in terms of accessibility, that's a huge chunk of people who are potentially experiencing issues with vision, cognitive skills, physical impairments. I won't go into too much detail, but it's really fascinating that actually these users are very active and they are spending vast amounts of their day online on multiple devices. So we can assume from an accessibility perspective that our product or these products that they're using are probably also on iPads, smartphones, desktops, maybe other publicly available devices. For example, maybe going into a library and using a publicly available computer there, for example. And you might be thinking, okay, first of all, how can we as developers and potentially tech professionals advocate for products which are more accessible to elderly users? Well, first of all, it's good to know that there is a lot of overlap between the requirements of elderly people and people who have disabilities. What really stuck out for me in my research was the whole concept of error prevention. So I've definitely come a cropper with this, where you've accidentally ordered 2 tickets instead of 1, for example. By and large, doesn't happen to me that often due to my lack of limitations. However, in the elderly experience, we want to probably design and develop products which have a recall system, particularly when it comes to financial or legal transactions. For example, if you are buying some shopping online, or if there are kind of complex terms and conditions which are quite serious in terms of like legal obligations, it makes sense that we have reversible state in our products, so that, for example, if a user clicks or enters a piece of information that is incorrect, they have maybe a timeout window or the opportunity to recall that so it doesn't become set in stone. Second of all, get rid of Captcha. Captcha validation is very, very prevalent online. You can see why it is, but essentially it is very confusing and very difficult for people with visual impairments to use. So perhaps we could consider providing an alternative such as text or text validation, or the opportunity to speak to a human customer service representative. And thirdly, just make the navigation easier. So if it's a website or a product, just make sure that you're including search functions, so that if a user is overwhelmed with page layout or doesn't feel comfortable or is overwhelmed in any way, they can quickly use the search function. Perhaps you'll include some predictive or search suggestions to avoid typos, which can often happen if you're having dexterity issues with your fingers. Sitemaps and also web page titles all help your elderly user to navigate your website and products a lot easier. The second use case is slow internet. So this is quite a shocking figure. 46% of global users are still using 2G and 3G networks. This is obviously not optimal, especially because we are, at least in the UK, we're moving towards networks such as 4 and 5G, which are obviously, we have a lot more of a focus in terms of how our products are being built towards 4 and 5G. But what's not to forget is that a lot of users simply do not have access to these better developed networks. So essentially, their devices will struggle to access websites or products which haven't been optimized for slow bandwidth or lack thereof completely. And an interesting fact that web pages, or desktop web pages at least, in 2020, they were an average weight or page weight of about 2,080 kilobytes, whereas the mobile web pages were about 1,885 kilobytes. So I'm not really passing comment on whether that is heavy or not, but it's ideal to have your own benchmarks within the company if you're considering users who might not have access to 4 and 5G networks, and decide whether or not these standards or averages are actually optimized for people who might not have great access to internet. Ways that you can kind of combat this and make your product more accessible to cover slow internet, which is of course is a socio-economic factor. Basically, try and make your web application as efficient as possible, and consider scenarios where a user might experience slower internet connection. So, for example, we've had the use case of users who only have access to 2 and 3G networks. You might also consider, for example, a user who is commuting through London or a major city on using their mobile phone, and also checking their emails on the train Wi-Fi on their laptop. In this consideration, you might well think, okay, this user is probably going to be experiencing different levels of internet speed and accessibility. So all in all, you should probably try to minimize the page size. Some of us may have heard of page weight budgets. So essentially, if you are designing a product or a website from scratch, you can have a budget for each page in terms of how heavy it's going to be. So to reduce for example, the amount of images or animations on the page, anything that could slow it down, avoiding heavy frameworks, or trying to make your code as lean as possible, basically, to limit the page weight and basically make it more accessible for slow internet or lack of coverage. Touched on this one, lean development is really important. So clean code and avoiding heavy or unnecessary frameworks or libraries will also speed up the efficiency of how quickly your page loads. And another consideration is using a tool like Google's Lighthouse. There is a browser option. Personally, as a developer, I prefer the continuous integration package, which you can integrate into everyday development. So every time that you push a pull request, you will get a report from Google Lighthouse as part of your pipeline to say, okay, you've scored X amount in web performance, you've scored X amount in web accessibility. And as a company, you can set what kind of goals or rates you want to achieve as part of, for example, Lighthouse rating. There are obviously other tools you can use, but I think this is a really cool option to make sure that accessibility and good coding standards are built in and baked in as part of your everyday development process. Cool. The third option is vision impairment. So essentially, this is an impairment that affects many people. As you can see here, 2.7 million people in the UK will experience sight loss by 2030, and that will drastically increase by 2050 as well. There are a range of reasons for why this is happening, but essentially having visual impairment is a big blocker for accessing the web and any services. So it's always good to bear in mind that if someone is a user is blind or has a severe sight impairment, they'll probably be using a browser or a screen reader, commonly known as text-to-speech software. So how can we optimize for this use case? Well, if you have a knowledge of screen readers or how browsers work, that's brilliant, especially if you have a quality assurance testing team that also bear this in mind whenever they're testing the product. As a developer, you can also consider, how is my code structure? If someone was using a screen reader, would this screen reader or potentially a keyboard, would this make sense to them, how I've set out my code? Alt tags. This is a common and well-recommended option, but this is fantastic for screen readers because if you have an image or a color or any video, for example, you can basically include a description of this in the alt tag so that the screen reader can then describe what is actually happening. So the user can then understand, okay, this image means XYZ, and can move on without having a vast amount of information missing because the image doesn't have a description. And last but not least, color contrast tools. So there are a vast amount of color contrast checkers out there. I've set or recommended WebAIM's contrast checker in here, but this is a really great way to make sure that however you've designed your website or your product, that it is easy to, or at least the text is easy to see based on the color scheme that you've gone for that particular product. This is a kind of maybe a use case that might be a bit some people might find a bit surprising for web accessibility, but mental health is definitely one. It's not in terms of the research that I conducted for this talk, there's not too much in the way of papers or research readily available, but mental health is considered a disability, and according to Mind, mixed anxiety and depression occurs in 8 in 100 people in any given week in the UK. So it's obviously a widespread problem. How can we optimize our products and services to ensure that people who are suffering bad mental health can also fully take part in the internet experience? Essentially, you need to just consider that this person has a mental impairment, and the aim should be to make sure that your product does not increase the cognitive load of the user. So when they log onto your website, it is as easy as possible to get the information or complete the tasks as possible. One of the things you can also do is increase response times. There are loads of ways that you can do this, but one of the best ways that you can check for anything that could be slowing your website or product down is use dead code detection tools and just hack out anything that you don't need to increase the response times. As a developer, it might not be something that you have a lot of, or that you might not be setting up so much in your product or service, but you can advocate for limiting the amount of advertising that appears in the product. Basically, too much advertisement or pop-ups can be a big distraction for people who are suffering with anxiety or depression, and can make the whole digital experience for that user more onerous because they're having more more tasks or more things to kind of switch their attention between. And last but not least, consider shallow page hierarchy. So essentially, the user can access information in as few steps as possible. They don't have to drill down through, 6 or 7 different layers to find the sign up page for whatever product. It just basically means that information is really easy to find. And the other use case I wanted to cover was to do with the workplace. So in the UK, about almost 60% of people in the UK use a computer at work. And according to Siftery, and I can definitely, I was surprised at this number, surprised but not surprised, that top companies use an average of 37 different tools to run their everyday operations. So essentially, a vast majority of us are using computers to, make our bread and butter, and are using lots of different tools and platforms and softwares to log in, check a report, export data, just to try and get our everyday work done. There's a lot going on and a lot of opportunities if you're potentially one of those products which is aimed at office professionals or tech professionals, to make sure that your tool is as easy to use as possible. So what are the considerations you could consider for office working? I want to say office working. Potentially a better idea is working on a computer. As the pandemic has proven, a lot of us are working in very different ways, but essentially our way of working is evolving massively, and so are our needs in terms of accessibility. So the first one is that obviously remote work and just generally globalization has meant that there are more people working in organizations where they don't speak their native language on a daily basis. So from working in Germany, I do know this feeling, which is fantastic. However, if you want to make sure that as many of your colleagues or as many of your clients who are using your professional products can have as fair advantage to do their job as possible, consider offering language support. So, for example, many developers are familiar with frameworks like IATNN. This basically allows you to support different languages in your product. It's a front-end framework which can be used or has been designed for major frameworks such as Vue, React, Angular, and much more. So essentially, you would just find the corresponding package, install it, and you would then be able to host different files with different languages, so you can then translate your product based on either the browser's language or whatever the user has set as their preference. Why is this also really important? So not only do we want our products to be able to be experienced in as easy a way as possible in another language, it's also crucial for things like date formats and currency formatting. This wildly differs. For example, my experience using online banking in Germany initially was a little bit of eyebrow raising. Maybe you'd want to do a £50 transfer, but actually commas are used quite widely in Europe. So when you're typing out £50 as a figure, it actually looks like €5,000, which essentially can be a bit of an eyebrow raise in that situation. And of course, for example, date formatting as well is crucial, especially if you are if your product is, for example, setting up or scheduling meetings or times in different time zones as well. Next point is keyboard accessibility. So almost half of people who work on a computer display symptoms of repetitive strain injury. In terms of ergonomic preventative measures, there's not too much you can do as a developer, but in terms of keyboard accessibility, just make sure that to be aware of complex components that can't facilitate keyboard interaction. So, for example, if someone has got a repetitive strain injury and is not able to fully use a mouse or something like that, they might be using a keyboard to tab or to limit the amount of motor movements in their hands as well. And last but not least, consider implementing dark or night mode. So essentially, this is meant to cut down the amount of blue light and make the product that you're using in dark mode easier on your eyes, as we all spend at least 8 or 9 hours a day looking at some device or other, be it a laptop or a mobile phone. UX guidelines have been published by Apple or Google, so those, if you've never implemented anything like that before, they're openly available, and they could be a good way to start and see what standards have been set there, and also work with your UX or design team to set themes so that the dark or night mode setting is consistent across all of your apps as well. Cool. Well, that's pretty much all from me. I just wanted to say that, of course, web accessibility is not always front of mind as we work on a day-to-day basis, but I do think it should be, because of the the 5 use cases that I've presented there. Essentially, we obviously want to optimize the accessibility that people have to the internet, and also impact and improve their quality of life. So as we've seen, there are many use cases that present or really underline how many of us actually experience web accessibility limitations, potentially on a daily basis, definitely more times throughout our lifetime than we'd like to consider. So it's definitely a case, if you think of yourself and others, how do we want to improve the lives of others? Well, if we want to improve the digital experience, then definitely make sure that you're advocating for web accessibility as much as you can. Thanks for listening, and
Thank you so much for the session. Thank you.
No worries.
I was actually wondering, do you think that there is a need for government regulation to ensure websites and apps are more accessible?
Definitely. So I know that the UN passed a kind of soft law in 2016 outlining that internet access is a human right, but it was not really setting the expectation on governments to provide internet access. It was more to protect the access that was already available. I know that, for example, in the US and to an extent in the UK, we're trying to make sure that the quality of internet is good for as many people as possible. And I know that, I think specifically in the US, they are more, they're a bit hotter on enforcing accessibility within their products. So to your question, yes. I think it would be a shame if a government actually has to set out legislation to say this needs to happen. But I guess it could be something that's helpful, that if it's not really seen as a priority in a lot of companies.
Okay, and then what do you think is the root cause for the lack of inclusion and diversity in tech?
That's a great question. I have to say that, I'm very, very lucky to say that I would count myself as currently a very able-bodied person in all of the respects. And it wasn't until 2020 when I had a sports injury, the pandemic hit, and suddenly I had my hand in a cast. And at the time, I was doing a lot of copywriting, and I just couldn't. I was expected to write a lot for my job. No one was in the office that could kind of help or type for me. So I started using Google's products for speech to type. And that's when I started to realize, actually, wow, if I can't type or I can't use my hands, this is very difficult. To your question, tech is obviously not known for being super diverse, and I think it could just be a kind of lack of awareness. For example, the research that I did for this talk really shone a light on to how many areas of accessibility that we just sort of overlook, or that perhaps many of us have this kind of, not in a sort of, it's not from a lack of benevolence, it's just more from a lack of understanding that if we don't know or have never experienced those limitations ourselves, we wouldn't necessarily think to include them or push for that accessibility when we're designing or programming a product.
Makes sense. And I know you touched point in multi-language access, keyboard accessibility, and dark and night mode. But do you have anything else that you think people and organizations should make to make tech industry more inclusive?
In terms of web accessibility, I think so. For example, I think it's great to have conversations with the wider company. For example, your colleagues in marketing, product, finance, sales, to kind of understand how your user. It's not great to think of what is the average user, because ultimately there's not really an average user. But having those conversations at work can sow the kind of mindset of, okay, we need to focus on our users as a whole, and potentially consider doing a web accessibility audit. I've heard of some companies setting this up. They have a kind of web accessibility or an accessibility team, and their job is to kind of regiment and police the product so that there is a standard always in place. Yeah, and of course there are a lot of really good sources of information out there. So W3G, WebAIM, a lot of major, for example, Google, I've mentioned like the Lighthouse product. A lot of products try and bake this in so that when you're generating a report, you're not just focusing on, say, for example, how fast is your website loading? It's also giving you the consideration, okay, how accessible is this? So yeah, to your question, it's a very big topic, but I think if it's important to you, have that discussion at work, and yeah, try and
Okay.
advocate as much as you can.
I can tell that you're very passionate about it, and I was wondering how and when did you get into web accessibility?
Oh, good question, actually. So good question. So I think that it's pretty recent, to be honest. It's been on my radar for quite a while. Essentially, in my current role, we're doing a really cool front end project, and as part of the kind of research for scaffolding and setting up the project, we were kind of given the freedom to look at ways we can optimize the front end like product itself. And so I started looking into how can you measure performance, and then that's when I started seeing, oh, actually you can have tools which bake in performance but also accessibility ratings. And that's when I started to think, yeah, okay, we obviously want to create a great, like, we want to have optimum usability, we want to have a good looking product, but we also want it to be accessible by our users, which are basically all over the world.
Okay, perfect. And then we have here a question from Thomas. So Thomas said, "Thank you for this presentation. It is good to encourage us to think of accessibility as something that affects people in a wide range of ways. Do you have any knowledge about good sources for application development advice regarding good accessibility considerations? Are you aware of components and frameworks that are good at considering accessibility and implement dynamic accessible considerations such as ARA, etc.?"
Yeah, great question. So there's quite a bit in there. I'm just going to try and make sure that I answer it fully. Good sources of application development advice. So W3G, this is a fantastic source where you have a kind of very, very holistic overview of the considerations that they've made and recommendations. And you can also then set, I think for particular like versions like 2.0, they will have a kind of standard to which your code needs to fulfill, I don't know, accessibility for people with vision impairment. So that's just an online resource. Massively would recommend that. Application development advice regarding good accessibility considerations. Yeah, so in this respect, it's very multi. You need to kind of come at it, if you're a developer, you need to come at it as a kind of interdisciplinary approach. It's all very well and good writing code that is super accessible, but there are other considerations as well. For example, you might want to talk to your UX team about what considerations they're going to make for the design of the product. You also want to talk to your product and sales professionals because they will have a lot of information about user research. So they will actually know who you're designing the product for. And the caveat is ideally you want to make your accessibility is about making it accessible for everyone, but it's kind of impossible to do. You can always strive for it. What you should try and do is then make it accessible for the most amount of users that you can, and define this within your business with all those different departments. So that's what I would say to that question. And components and frameworks are good at considering accessibility. So I had a look at design frameworks, for example, icons. I mean, it's very, I wouldn't say subjective, but it really depends on what kind of area you're looking at and what your accessibility use case is. Essentially, I would say that for main front-end frameworks such as like Vue or React or Angular, you can use packages to measure accessibility, which are specific to those frameworks. For example, Vue I18 for setting up language accessibility, Alternatively, Lighthouse also has, the Lighthouse CI package also has a view option as well. So I think it's not necessarily, from my perspective, too important in terms of what framework you go for. But obviously, in terms of how you set up your components, it's key that you have ones. Try to get as much unit testing and test coverage as possible, because that obviously shows that your code is not buggy and it's unlikely to throw lots of errors, which can then be distracting or kind of difficult for users with accessibility issues to kind of use. So yeah, component libraries, thorough testing, and making sure that you get libraries which are specific to the framework, that your front-end framework you're using, are really key for implementing that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Emily. It was very insightful. I wish we had more time, but thank you so much for the session.
Thanks, Maria, and thanks everyone for listening.